Thanks, Spiro. Great to be here, and actually great to see so many faces still semi-asleep on the afternoon of the last day after a big night. So thank you for your time. Just wanted to quickly talk you through what we do, what we have been doing. So firstly, we are an environmental charity. We're volunteer run. We do programmatic-based stuff, but essentially think of us as a dot connector. So if in our remit of tobacco waste we see an issue, we work with all parties, peak bodies, other NGOs to kind of solve that issue or try to solve that issue. Specifically, what have we been up to? We've been looking at our litter prevention strategy, so working with the EPA as a grant recipient to actually build out that tobacco waste strategy across New South Wales. So if there are any councils in the room that want to look and see what that does look like in the next 3 to 5 years, please feel free to reach out. We also spend some time advocating on the removal of plastic filters from cigarettes, the most littered item in the world. We're also engaged heavily with the Global Plastics Treaty discussions, and we've launched our Bucks for Butts, which is sort of an impact program. We already collect cigarette butts. Now your donation will basically help fund that. But mainly wanting to talk around vaping. So I guess we'll talk you through the journey of vaping and then talk about the solutions for vapes and how that potentially links in with the policy and the legislation. I'll skip through a lot of this stuff because it's more about the details, but all of these slides are available in the download section on our website anyway, so you've got them. But basically, these are all the theories around what happened with legislation around vapes in itself. So they were banned. Firstly, disposables were banned, and then any non-therapeutic vape was banned to be imported. But then resellers were able to still continue to sell to obviously over 18s, regardless of nicotine content. It was a bit of an amnesty. And then what happened was that stopped also. And then there was this moment in time for 3 months, July last year, where it became that you could only purchase a vape from a pharmacy with a prescription. That lasted 3 months and was rolled back. And basically now anyone over 18 can go into a pharmacy, get a mint, menthol or tobacco flavoured vape without a prescription. If you're under 18, you need a prescription. If you're in WA, you need a prescription because they passed extra laws. So that's what's happening. Everyone keeps saying, can you get vapes? Of course you can get vapes. I find them all the time. There's still vape stores. Well, technically, no, they're tobacconists, but yes, of course, they still have vapes. A lot of organised crime involved with that stuff as well. So some of the policing comes down to environmental health departments, but ultimately it's actually going to be a major crimes sort of unit somewhere in behind the scenes. And the big question is, has actually anything changed? Has anyone stopped seeing vapes exploding in bins, trucks and facilities? And the answer is no. Has anyone stopped seeing vapes being littered on the ground and packets littered on the ground? And the answer is no. I won't talk too much of this because you're in the room because you know it's an issue. We're talking about the actual amount of fires in them, talking about the batteries in them. I think that's been covered, throughout this week quite comprehensively, which is fantastic that it's getting the profile that it deserves. And, I remember talking about the MRF has been mentioned a couple of times. I think they're saying, well, the fire investigator basically stood over and said, well, we can't conclusively see, but that's a vape because there's plastic there and it's an embedded battery in such a small device. And the cans, I'm up from Cairns, and speaking with the team there, it was basically the same response. It's like, well, the report will say a lithium-ion battery, but we're pretty convinced it was a vape. We know that. We've heard that there's 10 to 12,000 fires each year in trucks and waste facilities. We've seen the photos and all that sort of stuff. So we know why there's an issue. Also wanted to focus on where you can vape. And this isn't a health seminar, but a lot of people from council are linked in also to enforcement teams. It's important to actually understand where you can, because where you can vape creates the litter and the waste issues. So it's always important to connect those situations. So basically think of everywhere you can't smoke, you can't vape. There's none of this, but except in this situation. So pretty much all enclosed public places, all outdoor public places under that list, which are listed as smoke-free or historically been listed as smoke-free, are also vape-free. And that's the law. And these are also ways that you can actually get resources. So if you go back and you're outside your health department, it's only got no smoking, and you want to update that to a sign that says no smoking, no vaping, or includes vaping. All of those catalogues are available by scanning that QR code, and if your cameras aren't quick enough, as mentioned, it's on our website. The whole deck is. Quickly, what are outdoor public places? These are the places where you can't smoke and therefore you can't vape. 10 metres of a children's playground, public swimming pools, spectator areas at sports grounds. But I think about where people do vape. And that is on buses, unfortunately, that is on planes, that is in stadiums, that is in nightclubs, where they can actually quickly get away with a puff of that vape. So when we talk about collection schemes, and I really want to work with the EPA with this, it's actually not about just making it available at a local transfer station. You've got to go to where the issue is, because this is where places are being confiscated because they shouldn't be there. They're confiscated en masse, and they're actually accumulating in a lot, which creates stockpiling issues. If you want to report non-compliance with anything to do with illegally selling vapes, to smoking in non-smoking areas and those sort of things, again, that's a QR code that takes you to the government website where you can specifically make those recommendations or those suggestions there. And then what happens if someone litters a vape? And I don't mean what happens to the environment. That's certainly not good. Just a little bit slow. But basically there's offences under that which fall under the Protection Act. Okay, there we go. Protection Environmental Organisations Act. So it's a primary piece of legislation there. It is considered dangerous littering. That was updated last year, which is fantastic because Queensland went first and New South Wales saw that and followed. So basically if you litter a vape, it is considered a dangerous item because of the nicotine juice, but also because of the hazardous components in the batteries and the chemistry from there. And essentially what that actually means is that there's a $1,000 fine. So if you see someone litter a vape, you're actually able to enforce that by requesting the removal of that and or further enforcement of that. Now, we're not saying enforcement's the number one thing we should always lead with. We lead with education, awareness, infrastructure and so on. But in a case where that's been in place and it's been repeatedly advertised and it's still not there, it's a revenue making opportunity as well. So we're talking about the cost that this actually creates. Well, there's a revenue making opportunity in there. And so those authorised officers basically are defined by the Act, and most of you will know, but local enforcement officer from the councils will generally have this in their remit and have the ability to do that. And I've sort of listed who some of those authorised officers are. So that's sort of the where you should, where you shouldn't vape, what can you do if you find someone is vaping or selling vapes, is there signage and so on. That's sort of a bit of the background of the logistics. So that's what's happening with vaping itself. Bigger question is, what can I do with my used vape? Where do I throw that? And I always sort of lead with, should they go in the bin? And of course, we all know the answer is no. And I've joked there that if you're in WA, of course you should, because they introduced zero e-waste to landfill ban, and I asked specifically, are vapes considered e-waste? No, they're absolutely not. They should continue to go into landfill. But how do they get to landfill? Landfill might be the way that they end up, but they shouldn't be going through waste management streams and recycling streams in order to get to landfill. So there's a bit of clarity or lack of clarity across the different states around their response to that. And in Victoria, of course, they do have zero e-waste to landfill ban, and vapes are included in that, which is fantastic, but they don't have a scheme in place to actually recycle or recover your vape. But then, of course, stockpiling batteries is also illegal. So there is really a need for a state or a national scheme, and they've obviously got some solutions, some commercial solutions are available at a cost. And the question is, what do those costs, or who should actually be paying for those costs? So if we look at what exists, we've got Recycle Smart that does their curbside collection, and a mixed bag or a vape bag actually is included in that. So if you're part of that group, then you can actually tap into that, whether that's your council or you're an individual subscriber, confirm with them, but as of last check last month, yes, they're still accepting vapes in that. So you've got that option. City of Sydney has one of the first councils to offer a vape collection, and obviously we've got the 21 new sites, the CRCs, which is fantastic, and we'd love to see that expanded further. But to be very clear, there is no statewide, let alone a national, collection service for used vapes. So we want to consider the future solutions, and I guess how does that fall with the New South Wales legislation? So obviously fantastic news coming out of New South Wales, and fantastic leadership by the EPA and by the Minister. It was a little disappointing to see the outcome of the EMM, which essentially that motion to take action on a national level was not passed, but very quick action the same day and very quickly after by Minister Sharp to say, well, New South Wales will go regardless. And setting up a model which can then be replicated is also great leadership, but it is disappointing because we should be talking about a national scheme, not state schemes. So we've obviously got this bill, which is fantastic. The one thing I really want to call out, and I've said this through to the EPA, and I've said this to those in the industry, is we're talking about no freeloaders, we're talking about regulating, we're talking about levying. That is fantastic. But how do you do that when the product's illegal? Who is going to pay for that? So is the Duracell going to pay for the vape that came in illegally in someone's suitcase from China? The answer is no. So who is going to pay for that? So it's either going to come through from your rate payment, through your tax payments, or via some funding from EPA, which ultimately, at the end of the day, comes from those sources as well. So I really want to understand how that's going to be approached. So we need the national scheme. It needs to be accessible in all jurisdictions. It needs to be tamper-proof, flame retardant. Seen some fantastic things from EcoCycle which actually go towards that, but we need to look at the costs then from there. We also need to consider the sensitivities of those that are vaping. We're talking about an illegal product now. It's not illegal to possess, but it's illegal to basically have. You're not allowed to sell it at a retailer, and if you're under 18, you're not supposed to be doing it. There's no penalty in place for that, but we want to make sure that they know where they'd go to dispose of that effectively. So is that in supermarkets alongside the bin? Does the bin get an expansion which actually then starts to accept also these forms of waste? But we need to make sure that there's zero judgment, because as soon as you start judging, then people will throw it in the bin because they don't want to actually be judged. So yeah, we're seeing people put their vapes in a sock and throwing it into the garbage bin at home so that mum and dad don't know, and that's ultimately what ends up into the bins, getting compressed, creating the fires. And as mentioned, world of illegal and illicit products, someone needs to pay. So what could that look like? We've had, and Spira will notice one of the logos on here. I'm not by any means suggesting that Mobile Muster starts collecting vapes, but what I'm saying is we've got some fantastic product stewardship programs which have already been in place, which have been established and set the ways forward that we could replicate, if not augment. The Return Unwanted Medicine scheme, which exists in pharmacies, is there an option to plug into that? Because now the only place you can legally buy a vape is from a pharmacy. You've got Mobile Muster, obviously, has gone through that before. Have they got learnings and a network that we could tap into? B-Cycle, and spoken many times with Libby, she'd love to see that being incorporated as part of that remit. But again, the question comes is who is going to fund that, because the industry cannot. And we've also then got the NTCRS. Now, their scope basically for their SEEE, the small electrical and electronic equipment, is anything that can be charged or plugs in is in scope, except vapes. And that, to me, doesn't make any sense. So if it doesn't fall into NTCRS, it's got to then fall into either a mandatory scheme based off building out the voluntary scheme or somewhere else. And then how can we fund that? So we're talking about the money there. You've potentially got levying legitimate vaping purchases. I don't know if someone would want to do that, but basically throwing an extra $5 or $10 on the legitimate purpose so that you can actually offset the cost of the illegal items. You've also got penalties from intercepted devices, so it's illegal, so there's penalties being created. That's largely being directed into Border Force at the moment, but surely a percentage of that to actually save would be far more important. You've also got duties and tax on tobacco. That's being reduced because you've got illicit tobacco there. So actually the available budget's gone from 16.6 billion down to about 8.4 and going down. So you've got less and less money that you could tap into. Then there's a federal government investment, which I'll run through in a second. But I really want to stress that the cost of inaction is far greater than any of that cost. The first time that there's a human life lost as a result of a vape battery exploding in the back of a truck or in a facility will be too late. And already the actual financial cost to the industry has been too much. So if you're in this room today and want to get involved, consider communicating with your ratepayers. So not to put your vape in the bin, but please have an alternative. What do you do with it? Because otherwise it's going to lead to some confusion. If you're already part of Recycle Smart, dial up the communications and make people know that there is vapes. If you do accept vapes into e-waste, let everyone know via a newsletter. If you are a CRC, let everyone know that you are accepting vapes. If you don't, start investigating what that could look like. Talk to EcoCycle, talk to the different options that you've actually got in the market that offer a commercial solution, and demand action on a state and a national action, level. I think the state here is very good again, but there still needs to be more to be done, especially specifically for vapes. And if we actually look at the opportunities behind that, the writing's very small, but the money is very big. So there's around about $20-something million which was allocated in the federal budget in November last year to tackle specifically this issue, and not a single cent of that has actually gone out yet. So we put in a budget submission specifically for these actions. The funding was allocated, but vaping's tricky because it's actually managed by health, not environment. So the funding is sitting with Treasury to be administered by health for a response to an environmental issue. So again, those in the room who actually have some clout, have some contacts, let's start talking about this. The funding is available. So before I said ratepayers shouldn't have to pay it, there is funding here in the budget. How do we actually make that happen? How do we make sure that the New South Wales scheme, the policy when it's implemented, can actually be funded from the federal money there? So in summary, we've been talking about this for 4 years. I think 3 years ago in this conference, I talked about this issue and the fact that it was a threat and coming through. The fact we're now sitting here and there has been action in the last few months, it's fantastic, but it's been very slow. Pharmacy-only sales model kind of creates an opportunity to actually have a recycling model there, but we can't forget the illicit vapes and how do we respond to that. NTCRS or B-Cycle are really good viable options to make that happen, and again, that funding is available, but remember the cost of inaction is going to be greater than the cost of that anyway. That's all from me. Thank you very much for listening in as I talk about vapes and butts and all the worlds of tobacco waste. Scan us and learn more there. Thank you.